How can the aviation system of an entire country collapse because of just one company?
Long lines and frustrated passengers. A fourth straight day.
You may have heard that this is about new rules on crew rest, but is it really that simple? Why would such rule changes only affect one airline in particular? Today, we're going to unpack the domino effect that led to IndiGo's mass cancellations and compare it to previous aviation meltdowns worldwide to understand if other similar disruptions could follow. Not necessarily in India, but perhaps somewhere closer to where you live. Now, thankfully, we don't see airline meltdowns very often, but they're not exactly unheard of either. In the United States, Southwest Airlines suffered a spectacular one in December 2022, when a mix of bad weather, a busy schedule, and some old IT created the perfect storm. Basically, like many aviation incidents and accidents, airline meltdowns are generally caused by a combination of factors. So while we'll dive into the rules around pilot duty and rest times in this video, this isn't just a story about rule change, as you've probably figured out. So let's go to India, where the country's aviation industry has made the global news for a few times in recent months, and for the wrong reasons. Most notably because of the tragic crash of Air India Flight 171 in June 2025. Intense scrutiny after that accident meant that more worrying stories emerged involving safety lapses and questionable record keeping for maintenance work, all of which tended to centre around Air India and its subsidiary Air India Express. But for the most part, IndiGo got a lot less attention. Air India may be the country's flag carrier, but it's IndiGo that's by far the country's biggest airline, with a revenue of $9 billion in the past business year. It's a low-cost carrier operating a fleet of over 360 Airbus A320 family jets, along with 46 ATR turboprops as we record this video. The airline has also been trying its hand at long-haul operations, and to make that work, they've wet leased some Boeing 777s and 787s from Turkish Airlines and North Atlantic Airways. Longer term, they've placed orders with Airbus for 60 A350 widebodies plus 40 options, which is on top of their order for 500 A320neo family aircraft that they placed in 2023, the biggest single aircraft order ever. All in all, IndiGo is a very successful airline with even bigger plans for the future, and they also have something that they're really proud of, their on-time performance. In a lot of their promotional materials, the airline refers to what it calls IndiGo Standard Time, a play on the India Standard Time. Now, like I said, IndiGo is a low-cost carrier, or LCC, and like most low-cost carriers, they rely on a high fleet utilization plan, meaning that each aircraft and crew make more flights per day than those of other airlines, which helps spread the costs of buying or leasing the plane over many flights. Obviously, such airlines need to do what they can to keep their schedule if they're going to achieve this high utilization, which is the additional effect of keeping customers happy, which is of course why IndiGo has decided to make its on-time performance a key part of their brand identity. However, the downside of that is that obviously the airline's reputation can take a really nasty hit when things go badly wrong, which is exactly what happened early in December 2025. Starting around the 3rd of December, IndiGo began to cancel hundreds of flights, which soon went into the thousands. By the 8th of December, more than 2,000 flights had been cancelled, with thousands more facing delays of many hours. On the 5th of December, IndiGo performed just over 700 flights between 113 airports instead of their usual 2,000 to 2,300 daily flights, explaining that this was an effort to reboot the systems and rosters so that they could start afresh the next day. And they did a lot better on the 6th, with over twice as many flights, but they were still about 500 flights per day short of their normal schedule. Factor in, let's say, 150 people for each one of those 500 flights, and you can see that this crisis was far from over. By the 12th of December, the number of cancellations had risen to 4,500 flights, and the airline informed India's aviation regulator that its schedule would not return to normal until February the 10th, 2026. So what happened? Well, at this point, we need to talk a little about flight duty time limitations and the implications that they have on pilots and cabin crews around the world. The reason we have such rules is because of fatigue and the risks it poses to aviation, which can be quite hard to notice as they build up over time. Generally speaking, there's two types of fatigue that we have to think about: transient fatigue and cumulative fatigue. Now, transient fatigue is the shorter term of the two, and it's probably the easiest for most people to understand and, importantly, to notice. It's basically the tiredness you get from immediate operational demands, the daily grind of work after long hours, especially when this work extends very late into the night, when your body would normally expect to be asleep, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. Cumulative fatigue, however, is much more insidious and potentially more dangerous because it can accumulate over days, weeks, or even months as frequent pressure from work is sustained over long periods without enough breaks in between. And because fatigue is a real threat to aviation safety, aviation authorities around the world have adopted a range of different duty limits, defined by day, by week, by month, and even by year to mitigate these threats. Now, these limits do differ a bit from place to place. ICAO, the United Nations aviation body, has defined some baseline limits that countries around the world can build upon. Some countries prefer to allow a bit of flexibility with additional safeguards that permit longer duties in specific and closely monitored conditions, while other authorities prefer to set relatively simple but absolute limits. And note here that I said relatively simple, because either way, these rules are not simple. Keeping track of daily, weekly and monthly limits can get very complicated very quickly, especially when night flying comes into the mix. Night flying is something that pilots and airlines are monitoring extra carefully. As I already said, when we do a job that requires high concentration at a time when our brain would normally expect to be resting against a nice soft pillow, we're extra susceptible to fatigue. We refer to such nocturnal periods as the window of circadian low, or WOCL as it's affectionately known, which refers to the disruption of the usual circadian rhythms of our bodies. And as I said earlier, different aviation authorities treat all such limits a little bit differently. And as it turns out, India's aviation regulator recently decided that they need to be extra strict when it comes to night flying. And I'm going to explain the implications of that and its role in this airline meltdown after this. Now, air traffic controllers track things like flight plans, altitude and more to keep everyone safe and operations smooth. But there's another kind of tracking that happens in the shadows and doesn't have your best interests at heart. Every time you browse online, you're leaving behind breadcrumbs of data, and bad actors can track which sites you visit, what you click on, and how long you stay to build a detailed profile about you. That's not so bad until you start getting random spam calls, fishy emails, and annoying ads for things that you don't even want. However, today's sponsor, NordVPN, helps you take back control of your digital footprint. By now, you know that they're more than just a standard VPN. Their Threat Protection Pro feature blocks these unwanted tracking cookies, erasing your online activity as you go, and it stops companies from building those detailed profiles about you. But it goes even further than that. Threat Protection Pro also scans websites before you visit them, blocking phishing sites and malware automatically so you're never exposed to risk. And the best part is that it keeps working in the background even when your VPN is disconnected. So to get started, visit nordvpn.com/mentor now, or scan this QR code to get 4 bonus months free with any 2-year plan. And with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. Thanks NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. Let's look at India's flight duty time limitations and how they changed in the past few weeks and months, because these changes happened over time. Now, as I said, these rules can get a bit complicated, so I'm not going to try and describe them in full, but I'm going to need your attention here. First, we've got maximum daily flight time and maximum flight duty periods. In India, max daily flight time is 10 hours, with maximum flight duty periods being defined as flight time plus 1 hour. But these are day limits, and they're adjusted downwards if night flying is included. There's also a requirement for 12 hours of minimum daily rest post-duty. Then we come to mandatory weekly rest requirements, which went up from 36 hours to 48 hours, which have to be consecutive and include 2 local nights. Cumulative 7-day duty is 60 hours with no changes from before, and the same goes for 28-day cumulative flight time, which remains limited to 100 hours. India's regulators now allow the country's airlines to adopt something called Fatigue Risk Management Systems, or FRMS, which other regulators around the world also use. This is a way to make changes to these limitations by using predictive analytics and real-world data on fatigue that still ensures safety margins can be maintained while allowing some flexibility in crew scheduling, but it also adds complexity. The last change that India's aviation regulator made involved night duties. First of all, the hours defining what a night duty actually is have changed. They used to be the hours between 2 AM and 6 AM, but now they're from midnight to 6 AM, which is actually a big difference. Also, pilots are restricted to no more than 2 consecutive night duties, and there's a new limit of 2 night landings per roster period, down from 6. For comparison, here in Europe, night duty is between 2 AM and 4:59 AM, and in the United States, it's midnight to 4:59 AM, but with a different time defining the window of circadian low, which I'm not going to get into here, but either way, the point is that India's new limits are quite strict compared to elsewhere in the world. Finally, note that as far as we've been able to find out, no other major aviation authority seems to have limits specifically on the number of night landings per roster period, although such limits could be part of an airline's fatigue risk management system. So how did these rule changes affect IndiGo so badly? Well, DGCA, India's aviation regulator, introduced these changes in 2 stages. The first one came in on the 1st of July 2025, and it was the increase of the weekly rest requirement from 36 to 48 hours. IndiGo and the rest of the country's airlines was actually able to absorb this change with very little trouble. However, then came phase 2, which is when night operations were redefined to be between midnight and 6 AM, and this is also when the limit for 2 night landings per roster period was brought in, along with the maximum 2 consecutive night duties. Now, this was a much bigger adjustment for the airlines to make, but crucially, this phase was introduced on the 1st of November 2025, so over a month before IndiGo suffered its meltdown. The airline did have higher than normal cancellations in November, but they mostly managed to handle the changes just like the other airlines did. So why was IndiGo affected worse than the other airlines, and why did it not happen immediately? Well, this is where we go back to IndiGo's operating model as a low-cost carrier with a high fleet utilization. Again, they're hardly the only airline operating in this manner, but an airline using its planes and its crews this hard, it needs to have really good resiliency. What that means is that such airlines need to have spare aircraft, spare engineers standing by who have the means to travel when a stranded plane might end up, and spare pilots also on standby and in the right places. However, as it turns out, IndiGo didn't have as much spare capacity as the other airlines did, especially when it came to spare pilots. And with these new rules coming in, each pilot could fly fewer hours, which meant that whatever thin margins the airline had became even thinner as soon as the new rules came into effect in November. So the rule change itself didn't break IndiGo's pilot roster, but as soon as that change was brought in, only a small disruption was needed to push that airline over the edge, and that's what happened on the 3rd of December 2025. On that day, a number of airports in India were hit by an annoying problem. An outage involving a Microsoft Windows-based service meant that the gate agents of several airlines had to check in passengers manually with handwritten boarding passes and other checks. This obviously slowed down operations, so airlines like IndiGo, Air India Express, Akasa, and SpiceJet were all affected. However, this only lasted a few hours. Later in the day, Air India announced that the outage was over and that service was returning back to normal. But obviously, that's not what happened with IndiGo. Now, it's also worth noting here that IndiGo performs more flights late at night, or red-eyes, than other airlines do, which means that they were especially vulnerable to the new rules that brought forward nighttime operations by 2 hours and limiting pilots to 2 night landings. When that check-in service outage happened, IndiGo quickly announced that 42 of its flights were delayed as a result. But as the day went on, IndiGo's pilots started running out of duty time and basically clocked out. This meant that many onward flights and subsequent flights weren't able to be flown because even if spare pilots were available, the planes were now at the wrong airport. And even worse, some flights that went on just fine landed at their destination but couldn't find an open gate because delayed planes were blocking all of them. And that in turn meant that pilots and cabin crews in the arriving planes had to extend their duty times as they waited on the ground, and they too ran out of hours. And you can see how the whole situation snowballed from there, with planes in the wrong places and pilots that were unable to fly, or also in the wrong place, or worse, both. So why did other airlines suffer a lot less than IndiGo? Well, it seems that these airlines used their aircraft and crews less frequently than IndiGo, simply because they had a different operating model. Or, according to some sources, low-cost carriers like Akasa Air or Air India Express, who would like to operate using a high utilisation model, tend to operate at lower capacity at the moment than usual because of late aircraft deliveries, which meant that they have more pilots than they otherwise would do, adding to that resiliency. This leaves one final question. Since this problem only affected IndiGo to such an extent, why did it have such a devastating effect on the whole of India's aviation? Well, we already know that IndiGo is a large airline, but there's a lot more to it than that. We also need to look at the state of aviation in India a little bit more broadly. Basically, this is an extremely competitive market for any airline to operate in. In the last few years, starting even before the pandemic, airlines such as Kingfisher, Jet Airways and Go First have gone bankrupt. SpiceJet nearly followed them too. New players like Akasa Air have emerged, and stories of airlines stealing each other's pilots made the news in India more than once. At the same time, India's government is building new airports and renovating existing ones, as we explained in a previous video, all in an effort to push mobility and drive growth. And that's why IndiGo placed that huge record-breaking 500 aircraft order a few years back, and Air India, which was recently privatised, placed an order that's almost as big too. The result is that IndiGo's market share in India is a whopping 64.5%, while Air India and Air India Express are at 26.7%. So the two of them account for over 91% of all passengers flying in India. Akasa Air is next up with a mere 5.1%. Again, this is an aviation market that's growing fast, which makes it really hard for others to follow and try and break this duopoly, which actually is more of a monopoly in some destinations that are only served by IndiGo. Those monster aircraft orders that IndiGo and Air India have placed suggest that this duopoly won't go away anytime soon. However, these new jets need new pilots, and it seems that even now, India as a whole faces a shortage of around 1,000 to 1,500 pilots, and it's not clear if these numbers take into account the higher need for pilots under the new flight duty time limitations. So, what did IndiGo and India's aviation authorities do to handle this crisis? Well, on the 5th of December, DGCA granted IndiGo a one-time exemption from its new limitations on night duties. And the next day, the regulator also introduced fare caps because, unsurprisingly, the sudden lack of flights from the country's largest airline sent airfares through the roof. In some places, there are also efforts to offer railway tickets to stranded passengers if possible. As for IndiGo, well, in December they estimated that they would need to pay over $55 million in compensation to stranded and delayed customers, but these numbers could get even higher depending on how many people were affected by the last-minute cancellations, or if IndiGo needs to pay fines on top of these compensations. However, I should emphasise here that there was very little sympathy for IndiGo's troubles. These rule changes were not introduced suddenly. The airlines first heard of them back in January 2024, when the plan was to start bringing them in from June that year. However, that introduction was delayed by over a year for the first phase, and it was nearly 2 years between the time the airlines were notified and IndiGo's meltdown actually happening. Again, this crisis created an image problem for the airline, and it will probably take some time before the country's people forgive them for what happened. Which is kind of a shame because IndiGo are broadly credited for making flying possible for a large section of the country's population. But what this story shows us more than anything is how important resilience is, especially when airlines have a high utilisation strategy for their fleet and their other resources, including their people, which, to be fair, is extremely hard to predict when airlines expand quickly, because it's then unclear what part of their operations need reinforcing first, months or years in advance. And remember, this isn't an issue specific to India. Do you remember Southwest's meltdown in 2022, how it was triggered at least in part by a similar lack of resilience, which exposed the rest of the airline's weaknesses? But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below if you were affected by any of these events, or if there are any other airline problems that you think we should be focusing on. My name's Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now, have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.